Hi, everyone. Dr. Melissa Durtschi here with Navigating Education, and just want to welcome you to our webinar series today. And our mission and purpose here at Navigating Education is to empower families and students with knowledge to choose the educational pathway that works best for them. We do that in two major ways. First is through evaluation for learning disabilities, and then the other is also consultative services to help with IEPs, 504s, things like that within the school system. A couple of housekeeping things before I present our wonderful presenter today. Housekeeping, please send any of your questions into the question and answer. We have moderators that will be moving those into to let me know to ask those questions during the presentation, and or we have a question and answer series. So after our presenter is done today, then we will have the question and answer portion. Any handouts for this webinar you'll be able to find on our YouTube channel. It'll be in the description of the YouTube video, so you can find it there. And I'm really happy to welcome Lizi Stephans today from Lindamood-Bell. Thank you, Lizi, for joining us today. And a little bit about what I know from Navigating Education point of view is the wonderful services that you guys provide at Lindamood-Bell, really focusing. I'm really excited to talk today about the imagery connection to language, because I know that there are many students that can benefit from this, especially students with that happen to have dyslexia, but any students that are struggling with reading and things like that. And I'm really excited to hear more about that and to be able to share that information with our audience. So our topic today is that imagery-language connection. Sometimes that can be specifically related to dyslexia, but it can be with lots of struggling readers. And Lizi, I'm going to turn the time over to you to introduce yourself, and then also about this topic of this imagery-language connection.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I am honored and excited to be here and share a little bit about what we do, and that imagery language connection that Dr. D just shared about is really what we're going to focus in on today. One of the things that we talked about when we were planning this presentation is that there's so many different kinds of services available, and it can be really helpful to find out what each one specializes in so that you can make the right decision about which one seems like the best fit. So that's what I'm hopefully going to be able to do here today. And just a very quick background about me. My background has been in linguistics and specifically in literacy, and I have been working with Lindamood-Bell for the last 5 years in various different capacities. And one of the reasons that I'm here is because I'm really passionate about working with neurodivergent students. I'm really passionate about helping learners of all different ages and all different backgrounds find access to literacy. And so that's really what we're going to talk a lot about today, is about how Lindamood-Bell can be the path to get there for some students. So I have a presentation that I have prepared, and I'm going to set a little timer for myself because I'm really passionate about this and I could talk about it for much longer than the time that I have. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started here. And the first thing I'm going to lead with is a quote from our founder, one of our founders, Nancy Bell, which is that we believe passionately that all children and adults can be taught to read and comprehend to their potential. And that's really why we're here today, to talk about how that imagery piece can be the key to unlocking literacy for people where up until a point, it has been uncertain if literacy is going to be a part of that student's learning, and how we can start to unlock that is what we really want to talk about today. So I'm going to share just a little bit about where we started. So for more than 30 years, we've been working with thousands of individuals of all ages and all levels of learning challenges. I like to tell people that the oldest student that I worked with was 60 years old. It was a pleasure and a delight. The youngest student I've worked with was 5 years old. Primarily, the students that I see are in that K through 12 range, because that's typically when we're noticing that learning is hard. But it goes to show that it really is never, quote unquote, too late. With that, so that imagery language connection can really help make literacy a possibility. So when we started in 1986, we had two founders, so Patricia Lindamood and Nancy Bell. Patricia Lindamood was a speech language pathologist, and so she was in schools, in hospitals, and in private practice, working with students of all different ages and trying to figure out what was going on with some of her students that did have diagnosed learning disabilities and some that did not, and why they were struggling to adapt in schools and respond to some of the remediation that was available. And then Nancy Bell started out as a classroom teacher, similar background to me, and she was noticing a lot of the similar, having similar observations and starting to wonder, okay, what can we do differently to start to help these students grow and feel success? So there were a lot of questions that Nancy Bell and Pat had, and specifically, when you're sitting across from a child or an adult who's struggling to read words, struggling to comprehend, you start to notice certain trends and patterns. And that's really what was going on for both of them, is that they were noticing that there were certain skills that students, some developed really naturally in a classroom setting, and others, it seemed like there was something missing along the way. And so trying to figure out what that missing piece might be. And so one of the questions they had was why some children decode so far below their potential and they're unable to catch up in spite of years of special education services, reading programs, private tutoring, all of the different resources available to them. And so trying to figure out what that missing piece would be. And then the second question they had is why there were some students who could read text very easily, but really struggle to comprehend what they read at all. And so it was at first, it seemed like two separate problems that were going on, but what they noticed was that both of those student profiles had in common was that what was going on for them in terms of resources at the time wasn't making the connection. It wasn't enough. And so there needed to be something additional that was worked on. So learning through observation and after experience in scientific research, starting to learn that the key was sensory input of imagery. And like Dr. D mentioned, imagery is really the big word that I want everyone to take away from this as being just our buzzword for the day, what we're going to talk about. Learning that imagery piece is the primary foundation for cognition and learning. And so what I mean by that is that they found that students who could visualize the letters in a word like cat, and you would say cat to them and they could say C-A-T. That ability seemed to be predictive of reading fluency. And then when they were talking to students about comprehension, if you said the word cat to them and they could tell you about a cat they pictured in their mind, that was linked to stronger reading comprehension. So that was what we started to unravel and do research with. And what we found is that all of these observations aligned with a theory of cognition called dual coding theory. And that was presented by Dr. Alan Pavio. There he is right there. And so this is a lot of jargony phrases here. The first one here says cognition is proportional to the extent that the coding mechanisms of mental representations, which is another way of saying imagery, and language are integrated. And so what he was finding in his research was that it wasn't enough for students to just be taking in the input of text, the input of language. There needed to be something additional going on in their brains in order for that to be retained and in order for that to be meaningful to them. And so that was when we started to think, okay, so a reading program to work with these students that haven't been able to grow needs to incorporate that imagery component. And so we're going to talk about 3 of these sensory cognitive functions connected to imagery. And so the first one that we're going to talk about is called symbol imagery, and that is going to be the ability to create mental imagery for sounds and letters within words. And so when I say a word like cat to you, like I said, you all are picturing there's a C and an A and a T. How do you know that it's not a K? You just do, because you have that imagery for that word in your mind and you know what all of those letters are supposed to look like. The second one we're going to talk about is concept imagery, which is your ability to create an image gestalt or whole for oral and written language. And the example I often give for that one is if you've ever read a novel and fallen in love with it, and then you go to the movie adaptation and you come out of the theater feeling frustrated, it didn't look right. That character wasn't the way I pictured they were going to be. Well, it's because you were making that mental imagery as you were reading without even realizing it. And it was that ability that allowed you to follow the action and map out what was going on in the book. For students who aren't able to do that, it's really difficult for them to retain. And so you might ask them what the chapter was about and they wouldn't be able to tell you. And we'll talk a little bit more about some concrete things you can look for if you suspect that your student might be struggling with one of those or both. And then the last one is phoneme awareness, which is the ability to perceive the identity, number, and sequence of sounds within words. And we know, especially for students with dyslexia, that can be a challenge. You say a word like cat to them and ask them how many sounds are in the word and what the first one is and the last one is, and they may not be able to tell you. And that is something that we really need as a precursor for literacy, to be able to hear and discern where all of those sounds are in the word. So those are the 3 pieces that we were learning. Okay, this is what students need in order to be able to grow. And it helps to think about language as being composed of parts and wholes. So when I'm thinking about the parts over here, this is what symbol imagery allows us to access. So knowing that the word clown is composed of these letters, knowing that that OW is going to say ow, and that's what helps us read the word and access it. And symbol imagery is going to be the key there for recognizing all those symbols. Then when we're talking about concept imagery, it's not enough to just read the word. You also have to be able to know what it means and store that. So you can see we've got our student here is picturing a clown at a rodeo because she's probably reading a sentence about it. So it's the ability to use your understanding of the meaning to also put that word into new contexts. And that's why it's different from just memorizing, because we want students to have a really dynamic image going on in their mind when they're reading to help them follow along. So when we're thinking about these, what does symbol imagery look like? So if a student's struggling with symbol imagery, what it can look like is they see a word like snakes here on the page, and they read it as steaks, and they either have no idea that they've made an error, or maybe they do, maybe they can tell based on the sentence they're reading that that doesn't make sense, but they're not able to pinpoint where in the word the error is. Now, we're sitting here and we can see it's that second letter right there that's different. But a student who's not able to visualize the word isn't going to be able to notice and do that comparison and go, oh, that can't be what I said. When we see students who do have intact phonological, so that's the sounds, and orthographic is the letters. When we have that imagery, it enables them to do what we call self-correction. So being able to say, oh, well, that can't be right, and all leading to independence. So a student might see snakes and think that it's steaks at first, but do a quick comparison and go, wait a minute, there would have to be a T in that second spot. That doesn't match what I just said and what I just saw on the page, and be able to say, actually, it's going to be the word snakes. And that quick symbol imagery and recall is what's going to help them eventually get the word right on the first try without having to think about it. So that's what you can think about with symbol imagery. And then when we're talking about concept imagery, there's a quote here, in one ear and out the other. That's a phrase people have often used to describe people where it feels like you're having a conversation with them and something's just not clicking. And what can be happening is if that imagery language connection isn't happening, that is what's going on. The language is coming in, but it's not hitting and it's not landing in the way that we want it to be. So what we found is that students who struggle with this, it can be oral language or written language or both. And what we see is students who are primarily grasping parts, random details, and facts. So let's say that they read a page about wildlife in Australia and you say, what did you read about? Well, they might say, I have no idea. I've seen students like that. Or they might say kangaroos. Are they wrong? No. Are they completely right? No. They were holding on to just one detail that they can recall and they weren't able to synthesize all the information together. And the reason that imagery is so key is because what we don't want is we don't want students who are just trying to memorize. Most of us are not capable of memorizing large quantities of text word for word, and so we're going to miss things. And imagery is what helps that language connect for a student and helps them be able to recall. If I ask you about what that chapter was about in your novel, you're not going to tell me word for word. You're going to tell me in your own words based on that image that you made in your mind. So we want the imaged whole. We want that synthesis to be happening. And one of the reasons we want it to be happening is because it's going to enable us to do higher order thinking. So being able to pull out a main idea, draw a conclusion, make an inference, being able to predict what's going to happen in the next chapter, in the next sentence. And this is why I often see students who struggle in this area come to me after those initial elementary grades or when they're getting into middle school, because that's when critical thinking starts to become more and more a part of curriculum. And so we see students in it, we're hearing they're checked out, they're not paying attention, their sentences are incomplete. And hopefully you guys are here because you've been talking to Dr. D and her team about there must be something else going on, there must be a reason. And we're on the same page about that. Those students are often really struggling with language processing. And until we build that language processing, they're not going to be able to make those same connections that we want them to be. So when we talk about reading, this is a lot of visuals here, but this is a resource I want you all to be able to have so you can go back and review it if you would like to. So when we talk about sensory cognitive functions and how they impact reading, the specific skills of reading that it can help with. And so thinking about your child and thinking about which parts of the reading puzzle might not be coming together so that you can, maybe this will resonate with you. So when we're talking about reading here, we're going to talk about some skills of what underlies reading and how imagery impacts those. So the first one we're going to talk about is word attack. And that's going to be your ability when you see a word you've never seen before to decode it, to problem solve it, using your understanding of the sounds and symbols that work within English. So we know that phoneme awareness and symbol imagery are going to be essential for that. So if I crack open a medical textbook right now, that's not my field of expertise, but I can sound out those words with a certain degree of accuracy because I know that TION is going to say shun no matter where I see it. That's an example of word attack. If that's all we were doing though, what we would see is students who are reading really slowly and laboriously, and then they get to a word that doesn't play fair, because I'm sure many of you have figured out by now, English is not very fair. There are a lot of rules that don't, or excuse me, a lot of words that don't play by the rules. We need another skill to help us with those. And so that's where this word recognition piece is going to come in here. And so this is your ability to use symbol imagery to harness that, to store words over a long period of time. So a word like the, we don't have to think about it. When we see THE, our brain just goes, that's the word the, and we recognize it. When I'm reading a text and I see a word like Byzantium, which I don't read all the time, so it's not really a high frequency word, my brain's still able to pick up on that pattern. So if I see another word that starts with a capital B and has a Z in it a couple paragraphs later, it's probably going to be that word. And so a lot of times parents really resonate with that piece, because what they have is a student who's been doing remediation that's helped a lot with sounding out, but they're not seeing it transfer to speed and comfort. And they're seeing their student, it's like, we worked on this word yesterday, and it's like they've never seen it before. And that's when we know symbol imagery might be something we want to work on. And then the third piece here is called contextual reading fluency. And that's your ability to predict the words that are coming next based on the words you've already read. So there's definitely a comprehension component bleeding into there. So the example I give for that is if you are reading paragraph about a zoo and there's a word that starts with EL, your brain goes, well, that's probably the word elephant. That would make sense. And that's a great shortcut that your brain takes to not have to work quite so hard. But that's not where the process stops. What we know is that symbol imagery is essential to do a really quick backwards comparison and go, okay, but does that word have a PH in it? Is it going to be the word elephant? Because what a lot of parents will tell me is, well, they just guess when they're reading, and they're using their concept imagery to go, well, this is a paragraph about this, so it's probably that word. And sometimes they're right, but sometimes they're not. And the difference between a guess and a prediction is being able to use that symbol imagery to verify and go, okay, yep, that's the word that we're looking for. And so vocabulary is going to play a huge role in that. It's also going to be really important for word attack and word recognition too. So I'm going to just write a V there. Vocabulary helps you when you're sounding out a word you've never read before, because maybe you've heard it in conversation and you go, oh, that's what that word is. It's going to help you store words over time if you know what they mean. It's going to help you predict the words that are coming. Vocabulary is really going to play a huge role in comprehension as well, which makes sense. If you understand a word and you know what it's supposed to, if it creates that image for you in your mind, when you're stringing it together with other words, you're more likely to be able to comprehend. And being able to string those words together, so to speak, is really where we're going to see concept imagery come into play. Now, the thing I want to point out here is that we've got these three circles on the inside, because if any one of these isn't working the way that they need to be, it can impact a student's comprehension. Because if they're not reading the words accurately, how can we expect them to get the right meaning from what they're trying to read? The other piece of that is there are some students where these inner circles are working great and they're still not able to make that mental movie. And so that's really why we have to dig in and do an assessment to figure out exactly what's going on for each student, because different people access and aren't able to access their imagery in different ways. So really quick here, I'm just going to walk you through some things that you can be thinking about if you're wondering if your student might struggle with this. So what it can look like if a student has weak symbol imagery or phoneme awareness. They're struggling with weak word attack, which is that ability to decode, weak word recognition. If they're really struggling to memorize and retain sight words, if you're seeing really slow, laborious decoding skills that are making them guess because they don't have another tool to figure out what they're reading. It can also show up with spelling. If you're struggling to figure out what your child is writing in a paragraph, some students spell really phonetically and they just can't seem to get that there are some words that are spelled a certain way. Other students, you're trying to read it, unless they read it out loud to you, you have no idea what it is they're trying to write. So there's different components for why that can be hard. And that is going to, all of these things are going to lead to struggles with reading fluently in context and struggling to monitor and notice their own errors. Sometimes it's because they're so used to reading inaccurately that they don't know how to monitor. Sometimes it's because they're just ready to get it over with and be done. And they are not wanting to slow down because they don't feel like they have the tools to figure out what that word is. And down here at the bottom, you're going to see if it's a severe weakness, they might have had a previous diagnosis of dyslexia. So what I tell parents is, just because you have a weakness in symbol imagery doesn't mean you have dyslexia. A lot of the students I meet that have dyslexia have that symbol imagery weakness that we know we need to remediate. So that's something that you can be watching out for. If we're talking about concept imagery with that comprehension, weak written language comprehension is the number one thing that you can notice. They read a paragraph, you ask them what they read, and they're not able to really tell you. But some other things that maybe aren't as intuitive right off the bat. So struggling with oral language comprehension, struggling to follow a direction that's more than one step, and being able to go, okay, you were supposed to do steps 1, 2, and 3, and you did 3 instead of starting at 1, or you weren't able to remember what came after 1. So following directions is the next, is couple points down. And then struggling with critical thinking and problem solving. So students who have an issue that they're trying to solve and they're not able to walk you through, okay, I need to do XYZ in order to get there. And that can be linked to a struggle to visualize the problem, which will help them get to the solution. Struggles to express language orally. If you've got a student that struggles with word finding, they're trying to tell you a story, they just can't get to the right words. And maybe sometimes they just get frustrated and say, oh, I don't know, oh, never mind. Difficulty interpreting social situations. I've got a lot of students that ask the same question over and over, and they don't seem to notice that that is hard for their peers, hard for their teachers. Struggles to understand cause and effect. If you're not able to visualize what the effect was, it can be hard to link it back to a cause. And then if it's a severe weakness, they may have had some diagnoses, including autism spectrum disorder, hyperlexia. Again, you don't have to have that diagnosis in order to struggle with that, but usually it's showing up in more than one area, which is where Dr. D and her team can really help illuminate, okay, there's some missing piece going on here with language. We know we want to look into what we can do to help. So
yeah, I wanted to mention something.
Please.
The connection that I made was this idea of the development of language over time, from word to sentence to paragraph. You mentioned at the paragraph level not being able to remember what they read. And that can be really confusing because as a parent, as somebody sitting beside them, a caretaker, and you're like, but you just read it. And it's that idea of, are they able to read, are they reading word for word? And many times if they have a hard time moving into that comprehension of sentence and then paragraph, it's because of the symbol and picture imagery. This imagery part is that they're not able to make this picture because I think of it like a CPU, like a central processing unit of like a computer. They're using all of their energy to decode something, and then it's not transferring over into that visual imagery piece, and so they can't hold on, or they have a hard time holding on, or don't know how to hold on to those information to kind of pull it forward. And so they get to the bottom of the paragraph or page, they're like, I have no idea what I just read. And it actually happens for lots of people, especially like when you go into auto drive and you can get to the bottom of a page, or you're listening to an audiobook that's really engaging, but then all of a sudden you're like, what just happened? I don't remember.
What did I read for the last 5 minutes?
Yeah, exactly. So the same type of thing is just happening more frequently for this child trying to read each word. And it's like they read the word and then they leave the word. They read the word, they leave the word. And that's that moving from reading word by word to the sentence level to the paragraph level. I just made that connection of like, yeah, they're having a hard time transferring that information into that visual and being able to make a concept imagery for that.
I think that's a really great connection to make. Yeah, I think that's a really great connection to make because I see that all the time with students. Sometimes they've had reading remediation, sometimes they haven't, but they've been putting so much effort and focus into being accurate that they've become analytical readers rather than global readers, and being able to take in all of the information. Because if we think back to that visual of the reading, that's why these circles exist within comprehension, because that's the point of why we're reading. But if you're getting caught up in these little areas here, it's really, really difficult to put any of mental energy into comprehending. So
And that's
Yeah.
actually one of the reasons when parents ask me, can you bring that picture back up? When
Oh, yeah,
parents
yeah.
ask me, what can I be doing to help my child? We work on sight words all the time, and absolutely those things are important.
Mm-hmm.
At school, if we're doing word attack, we're doing word recognition. Many times what's happening is that contextual reading fluency, being able to
Mm-hmm.
predict what comes next, can be an area that is harder
Mm-hmm.
we can pull apart a word for that word attack. We can practice all of our sight words, our fry list and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what I tell parents is I want you to read with them. I know that sounds probably silly. You've been doing that a lot. I want you to
Mm-hmm.
read with them, but then stop and talk about it
Yep.
and
Mm-hmm.
point things out. And oh my goodness, in my mind, I see this. Because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that imagery piece is where that where they need to practice more,
Yep.
is creating that contextual so that they can help to predict more words. Some kids are doing that auto
Mm-hmm.
pilot mode of like filling in the word in an
Mm-hmm.
auto fill,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
um, but that contextual stopping and talking,
Mm-hmm.
narrating in your mind what you're like out loud what you're doing in your mind. Oh my goodness, I thought that was so funny. Oh, I noticed this. I wonder if this will
Mm-hmm.
happen next. That part of the reading with kiddos can be really, really powerful because it's not
Yes.
just about reading to them. It's about supporting. They don't have to do the word attack. They don't have to do the word recognition right now. They can just focus on the contextual reading and
Yes.
making meaning while you're
Mm-hmm.
talking and just talking out loud about it. So thank you for sharing
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah, I think that's huge because the thing about concept imagery is it's sort of an assumed skill. We assume that just because you can read, it means you can comprehend. And sometimes doing that side by side reading and like you were saying, verbalizing, well, I pictured this. What did you see? Helps students start to go, oh, this is something everybody's doing all the time. And it can help parents start to notice if it's not happening automatically, because there's not always explicit comprehension instruction in schools. It's just sort of assumed if you learn to read, you'll learn to comprehend. But oftentimes there are students who need that modeled, sometimes because they've struggled so much with getting words off the page, and sometimes because that connection just hasn't happened for them before and they don't know that that's what everybody else is doing when they're reading. So I think that's huge. There's so much value in reading together with your kids in general, just exposing them to that and making that positive association with reading. But like you were saying, building the imagery is huge. So great suggestion. So to that point, when we're talking about figuring out what a student needs, there are some students who need support in one part of the sensory cognitive puzzle or the other, and there are others where it's integrated. And so that's what we're really trying to figure out when we're talking about processing. Is we can think about language as being this spectrum here, and where does a student fall? And some students are going to fall way over here. We know that comprehension can happen if they're able to get the words off the page, or we know that they're able to get words off the page, they're just not able to read them. But some students are right here in the middle, where we're just trying to figure out how much of this is your struggle to read, and then being able to go, okay, now that you're doing that, let's go back and make sure that you're also comprehending at the same time. So it's really important to have that differentiated approach, because every student is so different. And that's why doing testing can help to unpack that. So what we do as part of our process, we have a diagnostic learning ability evaluation, and it's going to be different than what you're going to get with the folks at NavEd. It's going to be more about some of these concrete pieces and also looking specifically at the different kinds of imagery. And what I want you all to know is that I always take into account any previous reports, any previous testing. They're really important to look through. It helps us know what to really hone in on in that testing. And if there's any repeat, we'll always make sure not to do it. We're not going to have invalid data. But what this testing is going to tell us is, how does this student compare to all the different students we've worked in with Lindamood-Bell before and had success with? And that's going to help us predict the amount of time that each student is going to need, because it's going to be differentiated based on what are the struggles that we're seeing, previous diagnoses, and also knowing what goals are, because different schools sometimes have different standards for what second grade looks like or what fifth grade looks like. And we want to take that into account and figure out, okay, so what are our goals and what is the profile we're working with right now? And how do we get from here to here? So that's really the part about my job that I love getting to do, is I'm the first person that families get to interact with, and we get to unpack that together and go through. And we have a testing summary that goes through percentiles and scores and all that jazz. And that can be really helpful to compare to other reports you've done, like a full neuropsych eval, to be able to go, yeah, we found the same weakness here and here. We were able to unpack this one a little bit more and figure out how symbol imagery is playing into that dyslexia diagnosis. And then we can say, okay, so what is the amount of time that we need to do to get this student to grade level? So one of the things that makes Lindamood-Bell unique is the intensity model. What we found in our research is that working with students for multiple hours per day for 5 days a week is when we're often able to see really big gains of months and years packed into a really short time frame. And getting those neurons to fire over and over and over again is how we start to see these new pathways happening, where students weren't using symbol imagery before, and now we're teaching their brain this is the path we want it to use every time you see a symbol on the page, every time you're trying to spell a word. And I've worked with students with many different profiles. I have a lot of students who have ADHD, and parents are going, oh my gosh, 4 hours a day, are you kidding me? How could we do that? And the answer is that we have done it. So we know that we have some strategies that have worked, but the other answer is professional collaboration. And that's where getting to work with your team is really essential, and being able to say, what have we found as the best learning style for your student? What's the best way? Do we need to do longer tasks or shorter tasks? Do we need to have visual schedules? Do we need to have checklists? What are the goals, and how are we going to help them see their own progress? That's really one of the other gifts of doing intensive interventions, is that students get to see a really huge amount of progress in a short time. And so if they've given up on being able to learn, which a lot of them have when I meet them, they don't feel like they're going to be able to do it. They don't feel like they're smart. In a couple of days, they're able to start to see, wait a minute, I can do something I couldn't do 4 days ago. And that can be a really powerful piece for helping get them invested and excited in what we're doing.
I wanted to add on that I think of learning profiles like an onion or something that has layers. I just use the idea of an onion, and we unpack some of the layers and we find, oh, this is where something, and it's kind of also like a microscope. We hone in a little bit more on, hey, we're struggling with reading fluency. We're struggling with word identification. We're struggling with these things. And then we can pass on, here are the areas that we're struggling with, and you guys really hone in on, this is the why. Here's the why of it, because having looked at the tests that are administered, I think it's great that your testing then hones in specifically on, here's the why behind why they're struggling with the word identification, why they're struggling with the fluency. And then it can be very intentional on working on the areas to fill those needs so that you do see that great progress.
Exactly. And I know that we're getting to be at the end of our time here, so I'll just say one last thing, which is, someone might be going, well, how do we do this? We know we've identified this imagery. We know that we've unpacked these layers of the onion. What comes next? And so the thing to know about Lindamood-Bell, knowing that it's intensive, knowing that it's highly differentiated, is that our goal is to develop processing. And so people will often think, well, is this tutoring? And the answer is no, it's really different than that. Because if it was about strategies and tools and tricks, a lot of these kids would have figured it out by now, because a lot of them are very bright and they have figured out so many other problem solving ways to get around some of these things that are challenging for them. So what we're actually trying to do is rewire the way that they're processing using that imagery so that that becomes their default. And so what you can be thinking about is, how do we set aside some time? Average we see our students is between 6 to 8 weeks. It can be more, it can be less. Like I said, highly differentiated. When can we set aside this time to do this intensive intervention, knowing that our goal is to eventually not need it anymore and be able to transition and phase this out? This is not a long-term solution or a long-term plan. Our goal is to really do something drastic, because we haven't seen changes with the other things we've been trying so far. And that is often when we're able to see, I have a 6th grader right now who came to me when he was reading at a 1st grade level. And over time, we've been building him up, and now he's reading at a middle school level, and his parents are going, we didn't think this was going to be possible. And the answer was doing intensity and doing instruction that had to do with imagery, because very, very highly intelligent student who had figured out so many other parts of learning and school, this was really the key that turned in the lock that was able to get him past that. And so that's really all that I have to share. I have a lot more that I could go into, but I want to respect everyone's time and just say I'm really grateful to get to be here and share more about this. And I want anyone to know that if they call and just have questions about the programs, about any of the pieces, that's one of the main parts of my role, is talking to families. And I never charge anyone for that initial conversation. It's a great time for me to get to know what you've been seeing, and if what you've been seeing fits in with what we work with students, and vice versa. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Lizi. A couple of questions that come to mind. Can you walk our audience through and I know it's highly individualized, and so you sharing what it might typically look like, it would be very highly individualized for the student, but what can they kind of expect for a day? Like, what would a life in the day kind of look like?
That's a great question. So most of our students are going to come for that 4 hours a day. And so we work with students both in center and online. And we have some great research showing that the programs are just as effective in either setting, which is great. So it's really just going to be us figuring out what's the right fit for your family. So those 4 hours a day, they're composed of 4 sessions, and there are about 5-minute breaks in between. There's a 15-minute break halfway through the day where we get to play games, give students a chance to interact with some of the other peers there. And what you can picture is that those sessions are often the same. They're very repetitive. They're based on a lesson plan that's written for about 55 minutes. And what we do is we cycle out the instructors so that they're not working with the same person for 4 hours. So they get a new person who's got new games, new strategies to do the same lesson plan, because again, it's that repetitive piece to get those neurons firing over and over again. Those lesson plans are written by our consultant team. They're like a case manager. They're the person that gets to work with the family. And so they take all that data, all those scores, everything that I give them, and we work together as a team to write multiple lesson plans per week that are customized to that student. And then our clinician team delivers that instruction. And those consultants are also the ones that get to meet with parents on a regular basis. So for some families, that's every other week. For some families, that's every week. We get to decide that together. And you get to observe what's going on in a session and then unpack that with the consultant and say, okay, what step in the program are we on? Why? Why are we doing this? Are we still on track to meet our goals? And what are some things we can start to do at home to start to make those connections happen outside of Lindamood-Bell? And then for the student, they're able to get, if they're here in center, they get their own space, which we love to have them decorate. If they're online, they get to work in their own little secure online room. And we do a lot of different pieces for student recognition. So every hour, students get what's called a magical learning moment, which is an opportunity for us to celebrate something amazing that they did. It can be something like you read a word that was really hard, but it can also be something like you advocated for yourself and asked for a brain break when you needed one. And that's awesome. And we all cheer as a team, and we get to put them in a box and then do a drawing on Fridays to see who gets to win the drawing. But then we send all of those home at the end of the week so that parents get to go through those moments together with their kids and go, wow, you did some really amazing things this week. So there's a lot of that recognition built in. And then we have celebrations at the halfway mark and at the end where the student gets to show off a little bit if they're comfortable and get a certificate and feel recognized. And that's really important. A lot of our students haven't experienced that in an academic setting before, and we want them to feel like this is a place where it's safe to make mistakes, where they can trust that their teachers are going to be kind and be patient, and we're also just going to celebrate all the things that are happening. So that's kind of the day in the life.
Yeah, thank you. It makes me think of, okay, so they've done this intensive intervention. What types of things are available to families as they transition? So they go back to general classroom, and what type of, is there like a kind of a step down from the intensity back to the classroom?
Guys, I promise I did not feed her this question, but it's perfect that you asked that. So that's exactly right. So I try to tell parents, you can think about it as we've got phase 1, which is our intensive, and then phase 2. So what we're going to do at the end of phase 1 is we're going to do an evaluation again of all those same tests we administered, see where we're at. If we still need some more foundational processing, we might recommend additional intensive time. But let's say we've gotten really close to our goals and we're really happy with it. What a lot of families will do is what's called our application to content phase. And what that looks like is students come in for 2 or 3 times a week. We really get to differentiate and decide, and they're bringing in work from school, and our instructors, the same ones that worked with them on those sensory cognitive pieces, are checking in and going, okay, are you using those skills when you're reading your novel, when you're making your study guide, when you're studying your vocabulary, when you're doing your spelling words for your test that you have next week? And that is a really great way. I tell parents it's like an insurance policy to make sure that everything we're doing is getting transferred over. I had a student once who was standing out here in the lobby, and I started talking to him about picturing and using it at school. And he looked at me and he said, wait, I can do this at school? And that's when his mom and I laughed and said, this is why we're doing application to content, because we know he can do it. It's showing him how he can use it in all these
Yes,
different arenas.
because I know that I have a lot of families ask about that very thing, like
Mm-hmm.
worrying about if they're receiving intervention, let's say at school, they're receiving this intensity,
Mm-hmm.
and then how do we make it apply from their intensity into, how do we transition it into the classroom, so
Mm-hmm.
that then, and these are the lifelong skills
Yep.
that they can continue to build on,
Mm-hmm.
the study techniques, the
Mm-hmm.
vocabulary, the highlighting, the, how they can use those visual techniques in the general classroom
Yep.
when they're doing content, and seeing that, oh, everything that I've been practicing the last couple of months, this is how I apply it. I love that there's that option for the application to the
Mm-hmm.
classroom. As far as, and you mentioned intensity, there
Mm-hmm.
are, I know from past talking with you and other people from Lindamood-Bell, that there's this summer program. I
Mm-hmm.
wonder, how does that look, when families, yes, absolutely summertime, what does it look like in the fall if a student is full-time at a public school, let's say?
Mm-hmm.
How does that translate over to pulling them? Is there anything, tips and tricks that you can give to families
Yeah.
on what does that look like? What hoops do they need to jump through, type of thing, to make it so that they can do intensity? And then,
Mm-hmm.
do most students go to public school for the afternoon, or how does
Mm-hmm.
that work?
That's a great question. And I always tell families, I wish we could schedule when a challenge is going to come, but we can't
Yeah,
always. So I do see a lot of families during the school year. And so what we do is we get a little bit more creative about our schedule and how we're going to do that. So I've absolutely had students who will miss part of their school day and come here. That tends to be easier for elementary age students than it does for ones who are a little bit older. What I've done also is I've reduced that daily hour amount to 2 hours a day for some students. And I always want to be clear, we're stretching it out. If it was 8 weeks, now it's 16 weeks. So we want to make sure that
right.
we are all on board about that. So that's a component. I have had some families who have made the decision, let's say we're talking about spring, and they say, you know what, we're just going to homeschool for a couple months here at the end. And that's going to allow them to have the flexibility to do 4 hours with you and then transition. So there's a lot of different ways that we can do it. The key is that we are always going to still find a way to do intensity, because if we didn't do intensity, I would be promising something I can't deliver on. So it's just a matter of us sitting down together, working together to figure out how can we make this possible.
That sounds really great. Another one that hopped into my mind is actually what my daughter does right now. Is she has a hybrid model where she has 7 class periods. She attends 5 of them at school, 2
Mm-hmm.
of them are online, because she
Mm-hmm.
needs that break. So
Yeah.
it could be a transition.
Mm-hmm.
They could take some classes at especially if they're in secondary, so middle school and high school. Let's say
Mm-hmm.
they would take some classes, their elective classes, either in the morning or afternoon, if it would be better to
Mm-hmm.
come to you in the morning. Then, and it's okay to schedule your, that would
Yeah.
be a great collaboration between our offices of how can we
Yes.
make sure that, they get the classes that they need. They could do
Mm-hmm.
some of them online and be flexible, where
Yep.
they do a little bit of intensity, making sure things are turned in, but then also get the helps and supports that they need through your office.
Yes.
So I just like to make sure that parents know there are tons of options, that just
Yes.
because a student is full-time at a school system,
Mm-hmm.
especially at quarter times, so beginning of semester, halfway through the semester, those are great transition times.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
there are options. Your
Yes.
student doesn't have to continue to fail again and again and again. There are
Yes.
lots of options along the way of, let's get the intensity and support that they need
Mm-hmm.
right now, and we can help make school fit the way that the
Yes.
student needs it. And I think that is very easy to fall into, is this idea of, well, we're locked into school. We don't have more time in our day. We can't create more time. It was something that I did, that was very easy for me to think until leaving public education and realizing, oh, there are so many options,
Right.
and we can make it fit the student. So
right. And one thing I'll add to that too is that a lot of families will say, I'm worried about them missing things. And my answer is, well, how much are they missing right now? Because they're not able to participate fully. And so if we have this temporary agreement that we're going to have them miss some things, but they're going to come back a more full participant, that's an investment that's worth thinking about. And the other piece I'll say too is we have our intervention model, and that's where we see a large portion of our students. We also, about 5 years ago, created a K through 12 private school option that's accredited, and it's one-to-one. And so that's what some families will do, because the intervention is actually built into the school year, meaning that we know we still are going to have time to do enough curriculum to get them a credit for, say, a 4th grade, 5th grade year, so that they could go on to transition back into a traditional classroom and they won't have missed anything. So that's another great option to be thinking about too. Depending on the time of year, it could be a good fit.
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning that. I think I want to leave it for families on this note of that there are lots of options within, meaning that if they are able to reach out to you guys, and it's a different way of thinking about schooling. And many times we have a fixed way of thinking about it because that's what we experience going through school system. So if that's our experience, we expect that it needs to be exactly the same, and that there can be a lot of flexibility within it, whether that be doing the K-12, whether that be a modified schedule, whether it's homeschooling, so many options that can be implemented. And I love the idea that you mentioned of how much are they missing right now. Because if they're not able to access it right now, then, and they're becoming overwhelmed.
Yes.
And stressed, right? And I always had to say when I was a teacher, we don't want to create ulcers in children. So the amount of stress in that social emotional part is definitely having an effect on academics. And it's this unwritten, unspoken, unseen part of learning, because it's really hard. I mean, we see the effects of it. We see the behaviors in the classroom. We see the disengagement. We see the attentional concerns. We see all of those things, but there can be a deeper root cause of, I don't know how to do this, but I don't know how to say that to someone.
Yes.
And so absolutely. I'm so glad that you guys are one of the resources that families can reach out to, and what would be the best way for example, let's say that we have some listeners that really want to reach out to you. What's the best way for them to get a hold of your office?
That's a great question. So we can definitely have our contact information there for people to reach. If you call the center number that's listed there, the reason I give that is because sometimes I'm up and about with students, and that number is always monitored by someone. And so I frequently have people call in, and if I'm available to take the call right then and there, I will drop what I'm doing and take that. And if not, then what we'll do is we'll just schedule it for later in that day or the next day. And I try to be really intentional about following up with parents right away, because I know that if we are talking, it probably means there's something big going on, and there may have been a large delay up until now to figure out what is going on. And there's a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety and a lot of, okay, can we get this figured out? And so calling that number is going to ensure that you get in touch with someone right away who can tell you, this is when we're going to talk to you, and this is when we're going to follow up. So that would be a good way.
Awesome. So they could leave their phone number, email address, things like that, and you guys will follow right up. Awesome.
Absolutely.
Well, Lizi, anything else that you want to leave with our listeners before we hop off?
Just that I want to commend everyone who's listening, who's on that journey of figuring out what's going on with your student. You are your child's best advocate already. You are showing up for them. And our goal is to partner with you, just like everyone here with Dr. D and all of her team, to find you the answers that you're looking for. And I want you to know that if there's something else that you need that I can't provide, I'm going to be honest, and I'm going to say, here's a great resource and here's a great tool for you, because we're all on the same team here of trying to figure out what we can do to help make learning feel better feel successful and feel good for this student. So just wanted to commend all the parents that are here listening, that you're on the right track. You haven't let your student down. You are their biggest supporter and advocate right now as you're trying to find answers, and anything we can do to partner with that, we'll be glad to do it.
And the fact that they're listening, and I love how you say that that they're not letting their student down. The very fact that you're listening to this to find more information tells us that you are doing everything that you can for your child.
Yes.
As a reminder, all the information, any handouts, contact information, all of that will be on the YouTube channel. And it's Navigating EDU, so short for Navigating Education. So we're on all social media sites under Navigating EDU. If you want to continue the conversation past this point, join our different social media outlets on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, things like that. And we'd love to continue the conversation with you. Thanks so much, Lizi, for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and excited to connect families with Lindamood-Bell.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
All right, thanks so much.
All right, bye.